Changing Traditions Through International Law with Dr. Fatemah Albader, episode 194. Are you ready to make your law firm a profit-generating machine that will free up your time and skyrocket your impact? With more than 2 decades of business growth experience and having proven that you can be successful while prioritizing your family and your impact, introducing the Profit with Law podcast. I am your host, the creator of the Firm Differentiator 10X Effect, Moshe Amsel. Well, hello and welcome to another guest interview here on the Profit with Law podcast. I'm your host, Moshe Amsel, and I have a treat for you today. Today's guest is going to be a little bit different than what we normally have on this show. We're going to delve into some specific legal issues on an international level, not necessarily anything regarding your profitability or the business of your law practice. So a little bit of a detour from what we normally have. But when I met our guest on LinkedIn and we've had our initial conversation, I said, you know what, we need to have you on the show because I think that it's just exciting to see what somebody is able to do. Come here and study law in the U.S. and go back to their country and become an academic there and get involved in the local law of that country. Let me share an exciting tool that I recently came across that is a game changer for law firms that bill hourly or by the project, otherwise known as flat fee billing. The 2020 Legal Trends Report published by Clio rates how important various items are in a client choosing your firm. You may be surprised to know that the third most important decision factor for someone choosing a lawyer is the ability to pay with a payment plan. The challenge that law firm owners face is the risk of a client not making good on that payment plan. Most attorneys don't offer payment plans because of that. The problem is now solved with LawFunder. LawFunder allows you to easily add a payment option to all your client invoices and retainer replenishment requests that does not require credit checks, applications, or any other complex process. The client's able to use their existing credit cards, allowing them to earn points and miles, access credit card specials on interest rates, and any other tools they use to manage their cash. When I saw this tool, I was blown away. Most importantly, it removes all the risk from the law firm and makes an easy and painless process to the payment process. So if you want to check off the box on one of the top factors in new client decisions, if you want to decrease your accounts receivable and get paid immediately, LawFunder is the solution. Go to lawfunder.com. That's lawfundar.com/profitwithlaw to learn more. No buzzwords, no jargon, no BS, just results to make your law firm grow. That's Legalese Marketing. Legalese Marketing is a full-service marketing agency for lawyers by legal experts and digital advertising specialists. Their goal? To help your firm stand out in a competitive marketplace with personalized solutions to help your law firm attract the clients you want, backed by the systems to make it all work correctly. Visit profitwithlaw.com/legalese to learn more. This podcast episode is sponsored by Noda, powered by M&T Bank. You went to law school to be a lawyer, not an accountant. Take advantage of Noda, a no-cost IOLTA management tool that helps solo and small law firms track client funds down to the penny. Enjoy peace of mind with one-click reconciliation, automated transaction alerts, and real-time bank data. Visit trustnoda.com to learn more. Terms and conditions may apply. So without wasting any more of your time, I'm going to give you the official bio here. Our guest today is Fatemah Albader, and she's an assistant professor of international law at Kuwait International Law School. She's also the co-chair of the Young Lawyers Interest Network and co-vice chair of publications of the Middle East Committee of the American Bar Association section of international law. And I'm really excited to have her here today. Fatemah, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Moshe. It's a pleasure to actually be here with you.
Awesome. And thank you for your time. I know time is precious, and I hope that we're going to make the next 30, 45 minutes really impactful for our audience. But before we start getting into the meat of the conversation, everybody always wants to know, who am I talking to? So if you can take a moment and just give us a little bit of your backstory. How did you get into law? How did you end up studying law in the U.S.? And your path to academia? Give us a little bit of the broad strokes so that we get to know who we're talking to.
Okay, definitely. Thank you so much. So when I used to live in Kuwait before my undergrad years, but when it was time for me to choose what undergrad university to go to, it was really just one university, University of Florida or nothing, because my mother was studying her PhDs at the time at the University of Florida. So I ended up doing my undergrad degrees in public relations and political science at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. From then, in both my majors, from political science and public relations, I found that I enjoyed my law classes the most. And so when it came time for me to decide whether or not I wanted to go back at that moment, or if I wanted to continue my studies, I thought that the best path for me would be to continue my studies, my legal studies. And so I applied to many different law schools. I ended up choosing Emory University School of Law in Atlanta, Georgia, and that's where I ended up graduating with my Doctorate of Law from. And then from then on, again, it came time, well, actually, if we take it back a step, during my time at Emory University, I was given the advantage of deciding whether or not I wanted to take, say, paper-based classes or exam-based classes. And I started to realize that I really liked my paper-based classes because it helped to strengthen my writing in a very good way. And so in addition to that, I served on Emory International Law Review. I found little by little that I kind of was building up my career to be a scholar in legal studies at the time, though I didn't yet know what field, right? But over the years, I came to realize that international law is what I wanted to do. I suppose that during my summer internships, I interned at various international organizations. I had one summer where I interned with the United Nations Development Program. And so slowly but surely, I started to realize that I was not just interested in international law, but I was interested in specific subfields of international law, mainly human rights law and humanitarian law. So right after I was finished with my Doctor of Law degree, I had decided to come back to Kuwait, and I became an assistant professor of international law at Kuwait's International Law School. And then at the same time, I decided to further my degree, further my studies by obtaining an LLM from Berkeley, which is still in the process. And so now I was supposed to be at Berkeley for the last summer, but because of Corona, I was able to do both at the same time, which has its own advantages, of course. But I just wanted to further my studies in that regard and be able to focus more on my research while I'm able to do that, specifically in human rights and humanitarian law.
Wow, what a journey. It's almost, my head's spinning just from all the different places that you've been and all the different studies that you've been taking. Now, let me ask you this, and it could be the answer is nothing at all, but why should a law firm owner in the U.S. who's doing any number of things, estate planning, bankruptcy law, family law, any of those things, why should they pay attention to what's going on in international law? Can you see any reason why that has implications to what they're doing today?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, it's very important for any lawyer in any field, no matter what the field is, to be able to have a basic understanding of the matter. And you never know where life would take you, right? So even if, let's say, you come from a common law jurisdiction like the United States, which, by the way, before I came to Kuwait, I considered myself as coming from a common law jurisdiction. And then when I come to Kuwait, which is a completely different legal system, say I'm back to a civil law jurisdiction now, there are sure, there are similarities, but there's also vast differences between the different fields, right? And so to take, for one example, family law. family law in the United States would be very different from family law in Kuwait. And then say, even if sometimes as multicultural as the United States is, say, for example, a lawyer is dealing with someone whose culture is just different from the US, right? And then this does happen. You see this a lot, for example, in immigration law. You do see this in family law. You do see this in criminal law at times. And when these things happen, it's good to have a background of who that person is and with what defines them and what their culture is like, right? Because whereas in the United States, we don't take religion into consideration, religion does have some considerations in those specific fields, and you would only be able to understand that particular person and what that person wants from a lawyer if you can understand that person's culture in full. And so this is just one of the reasons why it's really important to be able to look outside of what you're usually used to. And at the same time, of course, even if you never, say for example, which is very difficult for me to envision, but let's say you will never need to ever have to deal with a different system than your own, right? Well, then it's still very good to be able to have more knowledge and see what the differences are. And maybe you would learn something from that different legal system that would help your system become better in that regard. So even if it's just a learning opportunity, that would be great for your own career.
Awesome. Yeah. So one thing that you're an expert in is human rights. So I want to jump right into that discussion, and I want to couch it from the U.S. perspective, the U.S. point of view, and then and allow you to answer it from your perspective. But one of the massive things that we've been struggling with here is there's actually a few of them. One is this current Black Lives Matter movement that's happening, and there's two sides of the spectrum. There are people who are still racist, and they're against the whole movement, and they don't see what the problem is. And then there are a lot of people who see what the problem is, but somebody like me who's a Caucasian, American born citizen, even though I am compassionate about the plight of other people, and I want to give them equal access to every right that I have, often even in conversation, I will say something that is inherently racist, and I don't even realize it because it's so much part of the culture. So one struggle that we have here currently right now is this issue with Black Lives Matter, and really getting to have these minorities get on the same even playing field as everyone else, so that it's truly equal. Everyone's rights are equal. The other big issue is women in general. Women, they've been making great inroads ever since World War II, basically. But as a dad of 4 girls, I have a boy too, but I've got 4 girls, and I want them to have every opportunity that anyone else has. I don't want them to be at a disadvantage because they're female. And I think there's a lot of people who echo that. But at the same time, when we look at CEOs in top positions and board members of publicly traded companies and doctors and lawyers, it's still mostly like the majority is still held by men, and those in all of those top slots and professional statuses. Yes, women have made a tremendous push in the right direction there, but it's still a problem that we have. When we look at our issues here in the U.S. and compare them to perhaps the human rights issues that you are studying, writing about, researching in Kuwait or internationally, how do those compare? And are we really light years ahead, or are we just as behind as everyone else? And they're just, our problems are named differently, but they're really the same issue.
All right. So I'll take your question step by step, but the first thing that I wanted to point out is that no matter what country you're in, right? Every single country has its own issues. Every single country has its own human rights problems. It's just a matter of being able to try to solve them as best as we can, right? And this is, of course, where international law will come in. But when we talk about, even just to give you a quick example, for me, I'm currently working on a paper because our most recent elections in the National Assembly, which is our parliament, no women won any seats in the National Assembly. And so of a National Assembly of 50 members of parliament plus the 15 appointed ministers, there's really just one woman, but not elected. It's because she was appointed, right? And so for me to be able to make the argument that I'm trying to make right now in my paper, that this deserves this shows that we now need a quota in place, I look to what the Supreme Court of the United States has said about affirmative action in the past, right? And so this is one of the ways where I would have to compare the legal systems, because for me to make my argument as strong as I can, I would look and I would compare it to what other countries have been doing. And of course, since I studied in the United States, I'm pretty familiar with US constitutional law. And so I would look at what the Supreme Court says about quotas, in addition to, of course, what international law says about quotas, for me to be able to make my argument that we need a quota right now in Kuwait so that we could at least get a head start in electing women to the National Assembly, because nothing is changing, right? And so it becomes very important to be able to compare in that aspect. At the same time, what issues each country has will also depend on the makeup and the history of that country. So the United States has existed for many, many years. So they've had many more years to be able to go through all of this. And to this day, of course, there's still going to be some issues. Whereas human rights that we have here in the Middle East that might be issues, I suppose I would say that other countries might take for granted, because they wouldn't even think of them as being human rights issues today unless they look to see what's going on outside of their own countries. For example, women only gained the right to vote in 2005, right? Whereas women have had the right to vote for many more years in the American Constitution. And so these things take time. And then in addition to that, something that we have to consider here in Kuwait, which maybe we don't have to consider so much in the United States, is this idea of very strong cultural identity. A lot of the reasons why there's not that much change when you think about all these different human rights issues here in Kuwait is these very strong cultural ties that we still hold on to, that we try to break through, that we try to give new interpretation to, so that we show these traditionalists, I suppose, that things are changing, times are changing, and this is not actually what human rights should be like. And instead that there are, in fact, human rights grounded upon tradition, grounded upon custom. And this is our interpretation of that everyone deserves equal rights. Everyone deserves to be on an equal footing, right? I can give you the example of judges. So you never think about not electing a female judge to a court in the United States. It's not really an issue. Whereas for us in Kuwait, we only appointed our first cohort of female judges, if I'm not mistaken, within this past year. So I want to say July 2020. So for years, we've been living without any female representation as a judge in the court. And what makes this even more interesting is the fact that our judges in some courts they're not just Kuwaiti citizens, but they even come from outside of Kuwait, mainly Egypt. And when you can just have some judges come from Kuwait as well, if you open it up to both genders, right? Now, there's nothing wrong, of course, with having judges from other countries serve, but this is unique to Kuwait because not just to Kuwait, but it's not many countries that open up judgeships to non-citizens, right? And so, yes, that's it. There's many different reasons and justifications that are provided as to why human rights will differ based on the country that you're in and how much success every country has received. One will depend on time, and the other thing, it will depend on how easily or how we are able to break through these old traditions or break through all these customs that we need to be able to break through to show that this is what we need. And then one more thing that's unique to Kuwait right now is this fact that women are no longer silenced, right? They're demanding these things today. They're demanding equal rights. They're demanding a quota in place. They're demanding to serve as judges. They demanded the right to vote. And so when we speak up, because we're no longer silenced, that's when society changes. So, of course, in the United States, people have been speaking up for many, many years. And as you see, during COVID, for example, everyone from all around the world, for the first time, I would say, understood this concept of Black Lives Matter. Whereas maybe before, even though it has been a very big issue for many years in the United States, I wouldn't say a lot of people outside of the United States were aware. But because of increasing technology, because of people speaking up, this is leading to more change, and it's supposed to only go upward from then on out.
Let me share an exciting tool that I recently came across that is a game changer for law firms that bill hourly or by the project, otherwise known as flat fee billing. The 2020 Legal Trends Report published by Clio rates how important various items are in a client choosing your firm. You may be surprised to know that the third most important decision factor for someone choosing a lawyer is the ability to pay with a payment plan. The challenge that law firm owners face is the risk of a client not making good on that payment plan. Most attorneys don't offer payment plans because of that. The problem is now solved with LawFunder. LawFunder allows you to easily add a payment option to all your client invoices and retainer replenishment requests that does not require credit checks, applications, or any other complex process. The client's able to use their existing credit cards, allowing them to earn points and miles, access credit card specials on interest rates, and any other tools they use to manage their cash. When I saw this tool, I was blown away. Most importantly, it removes all the risk from the law firm and makes an easy and painless process to the payment process. So if you want to check off the box on one of the top factors in new client decisions, if you want to decrease your accounts receivable and get paid immediately, LawFunder is the solution. Go to lawfunder.com. That's lawfundar.com/profitwithlaw to learn more. No buzzwords, no jargon, no BS, just results to make your law firm grow. That's Legalese Marketing. Legalese Marketing is a full-service marketing agency for lawyers by legal experts and digital advertising specialists. Their goal? To help your firm stand out in a competitive marketplace with personalized solutions to help your law firm attract the clients you want, backed by the systems to make it all work correctly. Visit profitwithlaw.com/legalese to learn more. This podcast episode is sponsored by Noda, powered by M&T Bank. You went to law school to be a lawyer, not an accountant. Take advantage of Noda, a no-cost IOLTA management tool that helps solo and small law firms track client funds down to the penny. Enjoy peace of mind with one-click reconciliation, automated transaction alerts, and real-time bank data. Visit trustnoda.com to learn more. Terms and conditions may apply.
Right. It's creating more awareness of what's happening when it was happening all along. It's just that now we know about it. I want to go back to your paper and your idea of quotas to solve the problem. And I want to question whether quotas are really going to solve it. And I'm going to approach this from my own personal experience. So at the time that we're recording this, it's before the Law Firm Growth Summit. But by the time this gets released, it's very likely going to be after the event. One of the things that I have been challenged with is who is speaking at my event. And I have 30, 40 speakers at the event. And it has been pointed out. So in 2019, we ran the event and somebody made the issue of, hey, I hope, and it's come across like this, I hope that your panel is going to be more diversified so that I can attend or something like that, right? And I would love to have, we have a decent amount of female speakers. I would love to make it more equal. I would love to have more people of color speaking, men, women, doesn't matter. I would love to have more people of other minorities on my speaker panel. However, the expertise in the subject matter that I am trying to present at the summit, they don't necessarily, there isn't necessarily, if I have two Black females on my speaker panel, those are the only two that I found that are talking on the subject matter that I am presenting at the event. So if I had a quota that I have to fill 5 seats with African American females, then I would have to put 3 people who are not particularly experts in the subject matter on the panel. So having a quota doesn't really solve the problem, because it just forces us into a situation where, in your example, if you have a quota for parliament or a quota for judges, you might be forced to put people who are not qualified for the job into the position. So the question is why is there such a small supply of people who are eligible or are good for that particular position? And maybe the issue is much further or much earlier in the pipeline rather than at the election process. What do you think about that?
Right. Actually, I've heard your argument a lot, because everyone who I've been talking to about my paper doesn't really agree with my thoughts on the quota. But the way I see it, of course, my argument is not you have to put a quota and also maybe take someone with less expertise or that's less qualified for the position. That's not what I'm asking, right? All I'm asking is that they provide a quota system so that equally qualified individuals are able to get into these positions. Because when you think about elections, now I'm not talking about appointed positions. I'm not talking about positions where you get to choose, or one person gets to choose, or the government gets to choose who gets to serve in that position. I'm talking about elected positions where the democracy, the people get to choose who gets to serve in government, right? And so there's really 2 issues there. There's the one issue that women are not getting elected, and then there's the other issue that the people are not voting for them. And so that's another argument that I hear back that pushes back on my argument, right? The point that, well, no one's voting for them. But this again goes back to this idea of culture, which is why I personally believe in this particular situation temporarily. It doesn't have to be more permanent, but well, it shouldn't be permanent anyway, but just for the time being, to have sort of a push for women in Kuwait to gain these seats, as long as they are equally as qualified, by the way, you need a sort of quota in place to guarantee that. Because the reason, when you look back to why they're not being elected to these positions, is that there's sort of this stereotype that women are less qualified than men, that they are more emotional. You hear it all, or that sometimes you hear people saying that the only reason women vote is it's like a second vote for their father, it's a second vote for their son, or it's a second vote for their husband, right? So of course it's not all across all of Kuwait, but that is these things that I hear a lot. And so one of the ways to be able to push through at least to just get them to have an open door so that they can prove, and then from the next steps we can grow from there, is to sort of allow women to have some representation in government. And then how could we have a government without women as representatives anyway, when women make up 50% of the population, right? So just for the time being, just to get a head start, all I ask is that we give equally as qualified women some positions in government, some elected seats in government, until they are able to do so for themselves, which I am sure that they will be able to do so for themselves with time.
Right, but the question is why aren't people voting for them, right? If they're on the ballot and 50% of the population is women, and women are able to vote, why are they not getting the votes? Yeah, go ahead.
It goes back to what I was just saying, right? So they're sort of sometimes told to vote for the men, and then the second part goes to these stereotypes that they hold on to, that the men will do a better job, that women are not fit to be in these positions. But the only way to challenge these stereotypes is to be able to prove that these stereotypes aren't real. And the only way to do that is to be able to have women elected to these positions, so that they can unfortunately have to prove themselves.
Yeah, I wonder if there's things that need to be done in the media and in the entertainment side of it in order to prepare people for these possibilities. You know, in the US, is it taken for granted that women can be a judge because we have women judges, or because we have a show that's so popular called Judge Judy, right? You know, is the, you know, we just elected a female vice president. And we recently, you know, going 12 years back, we elected an African-American president. And you know, do those things happen because we were ready, or because there was some preparation in between the media or the entertainment industry, where we already had these concepts presented, and with a positive you know, hero type person in that, you know, in that character, you know, that has made us believe that this is, you know, this is going to have a positive outcome. You know, I I don't have any issue with your quota idea, but I do think that it's going to be very difficult to get people to get on board with it. I think that no matter how you cut it, if you make a quota, how do you determine which jurisdiction? You know, I don't know how your parliament is split up, but if I think about our Congress and our Senate, where, you know, each state or each certain amount of population gets a seat, you know, how do you decide which voters are going to be the ones that are forced to take a female, or which ones are going to be forced to take an, you know, an African American, or which, you know, if you're you know, using this quota system, and does that mean that for this particular seat there are only females on the ballot and you can choose between, you know, these three females? You know, how exactly would that work? I think that it's an interesting concept, because if you think about supply and demand, if you only have the supply is only women, the demand will have to at some level consume that, right? But at the same time, if you know, if you look at the demand side, you know, they're not winning right now, even if they're running. And you gotta question that. You gotta try to figure out, why is the demand not there, and how do we fix that? How do we fix the demand side so that when the supply is there, it's actually consumed? Does that make sense?
Right, it does. And actually, I wanted to go back to just explaining how it would work here anywhere, at least how I envision it to work, right? So the way that Kuwait is set up, now Kuwait is not as big as the United States, so we don't have so many districts, but we have it split into 5 districts. And within these 5 districts, you have the 10 candidates with the most votes that will be elected to the National Assembly, right? The Kuwaiti Parliament. And so the way I see it is, you would need a critical mass. You would need enough women, say something like starting with 30% at least, from across all 5 districts, because you do have some districts that are more conservative than others, and in fact, some districts that women might not even run in, right? And so I would say a critical mass across all 5 districts of 33%, enough so that women are able to make a difference. And so when we do have that, that would be a benefit, not just in the sense that, okay, now we have women who are elected, let's celebrate that. But then now you have a possibility of opening up to new ideas, opening up to new voices, things that we would have been closed off to previously. And so if you start small like that, but not small enough that you don't achieve a critical mass, then eventually with small changes, I think that things will head in the right direction. Now, let me actually just clarify something that I said. It's not that women were never elected to the National Assembly. So when women first obtained the right to vote, the first couple of elections after that, we had a pretty good number of women be elected to the National Assembly. I mean, good compared to what we have today, right? At a maximum, it was 4 women out of the 50. And when you see that, it all dwindled from that moment forward. And when you think about why that was, one of the reasons that the media often quotes as to why we don't have women elected these days is that the campaigning has sort of gone down from that point forward, right? Because when women first obtained the right to vote, they're campaigning so hard to get seats in elections, so hard. And then suddenly they push back and relax, thinking that this is going to be the norm now. But I don't see it that way. In fact, before these elections, I saw a lot of campaigns trying to get women elected to these positions. I think it has to come back to this idea of cultural identity, cultural traditions that you hold on to, customs that you hold on to until you can change these prevailing mindsets, these prevailing norms. You're not really going to see any changes in society's behavior.
Yeah, I wonder if rather than forcing the hand at the government level, in these elected positions, if it might be better to focus on the commercial side, right? So there's less bureaucracy and there's more ability to effectuate change in commerce than there is, in the private sector than there is at the government level, where people are, you're attacking their beliefs head on. You're questioning their own constitutional rights as a voter by saying we're going to force you to take X number of people of a certain kind as part of this quota, is to be your representative in government. Recently here in the U.S., Goldman Sachs was the first mover to do something like this, but I think that there's a number of companies that have followed suit behind, and even I think recently I heard something, maybe it was the New York Stock Exchange was doing something like this, but I'll just read you. I pulled up quickly on Goldman Sachs's website. At Davos, our CEO, David Solomon, announced a new standard for taking companies public: at least one diverse board member. Goldman Sachs, we are committed to driving diversity in our work with our clients and in our core commercial activities. We recognize that diversity is a shared priority among many of our clients and stakeholders, and we are further encouraged by the feedback we have received since David's announcement. As a trusted advisor, conversations with our clients have often centered around governance and board best practices. This announcement standardizes advice we regularly give to our clients: increased diversity of experience, gender identity, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation on boards, reduces the risks of groupthink, and unlocks creative and impactful solutions for their companies. As a continuation of these conversations, our ecosystem should call attention to how we are defining board-ready candidates. Limiting the definition of board-ready candidates to CEOs, CFOs, and other executives with former public board experiences excludes a large part of the pool who are qualified but took a different path to get there. So basically, Goldman Sachs said, hey, we're not taking your company public unless you have at least one diverse board member. With the exception of if you cannot find a candidate that's appropriate for your board, that's diverse, and you can demonstrate that you've tried, then I think that there's an exception in there. But I'm wondering if focusing on something like that, where you create these opportunities differently for the minorities, for the people who are not getting those positions, and when they start to hold positions of power in other places, the public starts to get used to the idea of these people being on the same playing field and being successful and being effective at what they do, where then they can somebody goes and runs for a seat in parliament and they were on the board of directors of a publicly traded company, or they were they were running some large enterprise, where now it suddenly gives them the backing, the expertise that people can view and say, oh, this person is somebody that's parliament material. What do you think about that?
Well, okay, so two thoughts that I have. First of all, the first thought that I had was, as good as the Goldman Sachs policy is, I actually have an issue with the fact that they require only one, or at least one. Still, some companies can say it's one, right? So at least
I would agree with you on that. I think it should be more, right?
Only because then it's like you're going to look at that one token diverse person who everyone knows is here so that they can land Goldman Sachs, right? And then it's in that case, you're not going to effectuate any positive change. As nice as that sounded, what you read out, one person is not going to effectuate any change by themselves, which is why I argue for the critical mass, right? And then the second point that I had was it still does make a difference whether you're in private sphere. Now, I'm not meaning private sphere in the home, but I mean like private sphere as in the company, the business, or the public sphere where you're basically running the country. So I don't really know how that would work in that particular situation, but regardless, when you're thinking elected positions, when you're thinking about running a government, regardless, even if you're thinking about running a business, right? The whole idea in that particular sense is that you go back to this tradition that women belong in the home. You go back to this tradition that women shouldn't be making decisions. I'm not sure how that would work in the private business context, but definitely when we're talking about elected positions, you have that negative stereotype there. So my issue would still be to try to tackle that stereotype, even if it means you have to force a quota down individuals' throats for the time being, because it's the only way that you'll be able to show that, look, women can be in positions, right? And it's happening slowly, even within government. So to just look at it more positively than negatively, before July, we didn't have female judges, right? And now we have the first cohort of female judges. So it's showing you that there is change in that aspect. Previous, we didn't have female ministers. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the first female minister of foreign affairs came from Kuwait when you're looking at all the Gulf countries, right? So we're changing for the better, but there's still this difference between appointed and elected. And so for us to be able to elect female women into positions of power, we're going to have to implement the quota system. And to tackle that argument, just because you mention it, one of my arguments for why we need a quota system isn't that we just need it, but it's also the fact that sometimes the international treaties that govern women's rights, in fact, mandate it. So when you look at the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, it actually mandates special temporary measures, such as the use of quota, saying that use of quota temporarily to rectify past and current discrimination should not be viewed as discriminatory, but should in fact be necessary in certain situations to be able to advance and further the rights of women in politics.
So, I understand where you're going, and I hope that it can do what you're expecting it to do. It's a tough battle to fight, because you're not just trying to change people's minds. You're not just trying to get them to think differently, but you really need to rewrite I don't know what here we have the Constitution, right? But essentially you really need to rewrite the basis of the how the government is founded or how it's run. And that, that's a big deal to get changed. So, I hope that you're able to figure out and navigate how to do it. I think ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out how to expedite the process, right? Instead of waiting for it to eventually happen over the course of the next 50 to 100 years, how do we make it happen in the next 5 years? Somebody recently told me that because of COVID, 2025 came 5 years early for the legal industry. And that's really true. It's forcing people to have to work from home and to have to, do things differently has opened up their eyes to the value of cloud technology, to the value of using video conferencing, to the value of doing electronic signatures. And that's basically accelerated this shift that was going to happen anyway in the legal industry. And what you're saying is, hey, this change is going to happen, but we need to find a way to accelerate it. We need to find a way to get people, to get women or to get minorities into these positions now, rather than just waiting for it to, for the public to eventually come to terms with it, and for them to naturally rise to the occasion through their own, wits and skills. And I would even argue that and I don't know what your education system looks like, but I would even argue that it goes back to society and the social norms and how we were brought up as kids. Even in the U.S. today, girls are more likely to be pushed to take dance than boys, and you start to look at those things and what are you doing really? Are you teaching them that they're different? Are you teaching boys that they're different? Because you're creating those differences from the get-go, boys like blue, women, girls like pink. Why? Why are any of those things in place? And until we start to change how we treat boys and girls in education when they're young, when they're impressionable, I think there's always going to be a divide that now we have to overcome later on. And I think that in a nation like Kuwait, where there's even deeper ties to religion, where there's, the custom is for the woman to be home and to, what are their educational opportunities growing up? Are they being taught to cook and to bake and to sew? Or are they being taught to, to get ready to become doctors, lawyers, and mathematicians and economics? What is happening when they're really young? And if we look at that, I think that that's really where the problem stems from. And, that if you really want to effectuate long-term change, we need to start changing how we act as a society early on.
Absolutely. So just to piggyback on what you said, I absolutely agree that change has to start with your education, right? But in Kuwait, I would argue that it's, for me, the traditional way of thinking, or the conservative way of thinking for me, requires just a little bit more education, right? Because education, fortunately, is not an issue here. I wouldn't say that there's a divide in the education system itself between men and women. Yes, some schools, there's segregation of schools between men and women. There's segregation of classes between men and women, but they're still taught the same thing, right? But it also goes back to how the professor or the teacher, if you're talking about young kids, how the professor or the teacher looks at that student, how much worth, I guess, that teacher or professor gives to each student based on their gender, if they themselves create gender divides within the classroom, because if they do that, or if they support it in any way, surely that's going to lead to a system of sort of discrimination later on, even within an individual's own thoughts, right? So it goes back to education. And I absolutely agree that this is one of the ways that we can tackle this issue. But again, that would also take time, because what I would be advocating for now is to do something at this moment while it's fresh in everyone's mind, while it's hot topic. Whereas the next logical step is also to try to ensure that there's no difference from how the teacher views his or her students in the classroom.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to move away from this conversation and tackle one more thing before we're done. And that is in the green room before we started recording. I asked you, are human rights and women's rights one and the same? And you said absolutely not. And we focused a lot on women's rights, and I think that we tend to, when we have human right conversations, it tends to skew towards women's rights. So I want to just go back and ask you, what are some of the human rights issues that you see challenging Kuwait that are not specific to women? And where we might find parallels ourselves, but not necessary. Like what are some of the human rights issues that are affecting everybody across the board?
All right, so I wanted to start that off by saying the reason the discussion is so focused on women's rights is because if you ask me what human rights I focus on in more detail, I would say women's rights, right? So even within Kuwait, come to think of it, every time, the moment you ask me that question, I think of all the research papers that I wrote, and one's about citizenship rights and the divide between women and men, and then one is about honor killings that obviously affects women. Now it's electing women to the National Assembly. So of course my focus is a lot on human rights, on women's rights, not human rights. a subfield of human rights. See, I did that too. But when we talk about other human rights that faces Kuwait, one thing that comes to mind is freedom of speech, which is something we are working on as of right now. We don't really have freedom of speech in the same way that you would think about it in the United States. Now, of course, even in the United States, there are some limitations, though not many, because the United States Constitution is not going to tolerate many limitations on freedom of speech. You have your 3 categories of limitations, and that's about it, really. But when it comes to freedom of speech in the Kuwait, the list grows and grows and grows. So one of the big issues comes from freedom of speech. So that's one that I can think of outside of women's rights. Children's rights could be another one as well, because when you're thinking about rights in adoption, that's very different from what you would see in the United States because of Islamically held values. And so there are some issues with children's rights as well. Migrant rights is another one. So when you're looking at the discrimination between or against migrants in Kuwait, that's a very hot topic issue here in Kuwait as well. So these are just some examples that I can think of at the top of my head outside of women's rights.
Very interesting. And I wish we had more time. We could delve into those. Is sex trafficking an issue in Kuwait that like it is in the U.S.? The U.S. I mean, a lot of U.S. citizens aren't aware of the issue or anything like that. But I've supported a couple of organizations that are fighting sex trafficking, and it's mind-boggling how prevalent it really is here and it's in the United States, but it's international, right? The people are being sent internationally, or people are being brought internationally. Is that something that's an issue there as well?
So to my knowledge, not as much as you would hear about it in, let's say, countries like Thailand, right? So I would say, no, this isn't really much of a focus here. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen at all. I'm sure it does, but not to the extent that it happens in other countries. No.
Okay. And before we close it out, one final thing, like what if for somebody who's listening to this and, we talked quite a bit about women's rights. And I think that this is a very important topic. I think that we can relate to that topic directly with what's going on here with minority rights, with Black Lives Matter. And, we're making an issue for Black folk, people of color, but, it's any minority, in the U.S. I mean, one of the things that's been kind of highlighted in TV shows recently is Asians being discriminated against because where did the coronavirus come from, right? And it's whenever we have any reason to suddenly bigotry and racism becomes it rears its ugly head, and it's there, so if we can have one takeaway from this conversation, how can each individual who's listening to this participate in effectuating change moving forward? If there's one thing that they can do that might help with the overall process. I don't think any one of us believes that we're going to change the system, but maybe we can each do something to help contribute to the fix.
Right, absolutely. So actually, it's interesting that you mention what's going on with Asians now. And this is something that you see, and I promise I'm going to try to keep it short, but this is something that you see with any new virus that comes up, right? Every time, and when you look back at what stems those racist thoughts or provokes those racist actions, it goes back to this idea of fear. People are afraid. So when it comes to COVID, for example, we see a lot of racist attacks on people of Asian descent. And if you look at the news, it's not just against those who are Chinese, even though that too is unwarranted. It's against anyone who might look Chinese as well. So you had a lot of attacks against Americans that have been living in the United States for so many years. And when they were attacked based on their the fact that they looked Asian, right? So this is something that happened, of course, not just America, it happened all over the world with COVID, and you've seen this with other diseases in the past, and it stems from this idea of fear. And so for that, the one way to be able to tackle this individually, one by one, is to just educate yourself and not rely on what's going on in the media, because anyone has access today to social media. Anyone has access to the internet. Anyone can post whatever they want to post online. And so they need to do their due diligence. You need to do your due diligence to be able to decide for yourself if this is the correct information or not. Factually check your information. And regardless, it's a choice whether or not you choose to discriminate. It's a choice whether you choose to attack or not. And so you should choose not to do so in any situation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fatemah. If you can just, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, wants to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I suppose email would be best. So I can go ahead and provide my email. It's going to be f.albader@kilaw.edu.kw. So it's f.albader@kilaw.edu.kw.
Awesome. And folks, we're going to link up that email address in the show notes so that you can send an email over to Fatemah, whether it's to connect with her, to just let her know how this particular conversation impacted you, or if you want to ask her anything specific, feel free to send her an email. And Fatemah, I appreciate your time. And this was a very insightful conversation. I really enjoyed discussing the issue. And I'd like to know when that paper is done. I'd love an opportunity to read it. And that's basically it, folks. Wraps up another great guest interview here on the Profit with Law podcast. If this is your first time listening to the show, you want to make sure to hit that subscribe button in your podcast player so that you get notified every time we release a new episode. We release those episodes twice a week, every Tuesday and Thursday. And if this is not your first time listening to the show and you're already a subscriber, we would love it if you just took a moment and shared this interview with somebody else who you think could benefit from it, who would enjoy it. The more that our listeners do that, share it with somebody else, the more people that we get turned on to the show and the better impact that we can have. And with that, I'm going to close this out. We'll see you on our next episode. Take care.
Have you been enjoying the show? We sure hope so. To make sure you never miss an episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button in your podcast player app. Next week, we will be back with more valuable resources and ideas on how to break the mold and take your law firm to the next level.